just south of the Yalu River. The sky over northwestern Korea is split between two worlds above 30,000 feet. There is silence, jet trails, and tension thick enough to cut. Below, on radar scopes and airfield strips, a deadly game is about to play out. 4 MiG-15 seconds, sleek, silver, Soviet-built roar into the sky from a Chinese airfield near Antung. Their mission is clear: intercept and destroy any United Nations bombers daring to strike north of the 38th parallel. Flying in tight formation, the Soviet-flown jets tear through the clouds toward a region both feared and infamous. The Americans call it MiG Alley. They expect resistance, but not what's coming. Out of the haze, diving at blistering speed, come a trio of F-86 Sabres. Swept wing, shark-nosed, and battle-tested. They aren't there to escort. They're there to hunt. In less than 60 seconds, the sky erupts. Cannons scream. Jet engines wail. One MiG tries to brake left, climbing hard. A Sabre matches the move, flips vertical, and fires. A flash. Smoke. Debris trails down like metallic snow. The MiG is gone. The Soviets are stunned. The F-86 doesn't behave like any interceptor they've seen. It doesn't just attack at duels. It anticipates. It dances in the sky, turns inside their arcs, climbs with them, and fires with unrelenting precision. When the dust settles, 3 MiGs are down. The Sabres are untouched. But this isn't a fluke. This will happen again, and again, and again, for 3 straight years. The Soviets had believed MiG-15 seconds would rule the Korean skies. Their design was cutting edge. Their pilots, many veterans of World War II, were trained, aggressive, and convinced of their superiority. But dogfights tell a harsher truth, and MiG Alley would become the graveyard of that illusion. Because something unexpected had entered the war, not just a better plane, but a better system, not just a rival pilot, but a rival doctrine. And in the jet-powered crucible above Korea, that difference would become undeniable. In the months leading up to the Korean War, Soviet aviation engineers believed they had produced the ultimate answer to American air power. The MiG-15 had everything the doctrine of the era demanded: blistering climb rates, swept wings for supersonic maneuvering, and 2 heavy-hitting cannons capable of tearing through bombers with a single pass. It was fast, brutal, revolutionary. By all measures, it should have been untouchable. Soviet high command had invested deeply in the concept of vertical dominance. Engage at high altitude, strike hard, and disengage before the enemy could react. Dogfighting, in their minds, was outdated, too risky, too inefficient. The MiG-15 was built to end air combat in seconds, not prolong it. Even American analysts, after glimpsing early specs, were nervous. The U.S. had been relying on F-80 shooting stars and older piston-engine Mustangs. These were planes built for a different war. Against the MiG-15, they were being cut apart. The skies over North Korea were quickly turning into a death zone. The MiG-15 seconds were operating from airfields just over the Chinese border, safe, legal cover under the guise of volunteer pilots. But these volunteers weren't amateurs. They were Soviet Air Force officers, many with combat experience over the Eastern Front. And now, under different uniforms and call signs, they were back in the sky with a purpose: test Soviet jets against the best America had to offer. In the first months of combat, the numbers seemed to favor the MiGs. F-80 seconds were being shot down at an alarming rate. B-29 bombers were suddenly vulnerable. American formations had to be restructured, escorted, defended. Inside Pentagon war rooms, the phrase MiG Alley was born out of frustration, not strategy. But then came the Sabres. The F-86 Sabre was no longer just a concept. It had entered active service, designed not just to match the MiG, but to beat it in its own domain. Yet the Soviet assumptions didn't change. They still believed that superiority came from the airframe alone. They looked at engine thrust, rate of climb, maximum altitude, The numbers told them they were ahead. But what they failed to account for was the pilot inside the cockpit and the system behind the machine. American pilots weren't just trained, they were bred in a culture of improvisation, initiative, and air dominance. They were taught to outthink, not just outfly. Their mission wasn't survival, it was supremacy. And when these Sabres entered MiG Alley, they didn't follow the Soviet script, they rewrote it. To Soviet strategists, air combat was supposed to be mathematical. The MiG-15, with its Klimov VK-1 turbojet engine, boasted a service ceiling above 50,000 feet and a climb rate that could leave early jets in its contrail. It carried two heavy autocannons, a 23mm and a 37mm that could pulverize bombers in seconds. On paper, it was the perfect predator. So why were their kills slowing down? And why were their own losses accelerating? The truth was found not in statistics, but in a rupture of doctrine. The Soviets had built their entire air war strategy around short, high-speed intercepts. Get in, fire once or twice, and leave the engagement. Their pilots were trained to exploit the MiG's vertical performance, not to linger in horizontal maneuvering fights. Dogfights, by Soviet standards, were relics of World War II. The Americans didn't see it that way. When the F-86 Sabre entered the Korean theater, it brought something the MiG had never truly faced before. An opponent designed not just to intercept, but to sustain combat at every altitude. Its General Electric J-47 engine didn't climb as fast as the MiG's, but it provided smoother throttle transitions critical in edge-of-stall maneuvers. Its 6 50-caliber Browning M3 machine guns, often underestimated by Soviet planners, had a higher rate of fire, more total ammunition, and better hit probability in turning fights. And most important, the Sabre was designed for the dogfight. It could roll faster, handle better at low speeds, and it excelled in what American pilots called the vertical scissors, a maneuvering contest the MiG was ill-prepared for. The Sabre's bubble canopy gave pilots a nearly unrestricted view, while the MiG's cockpit layout limited rearward visibility, especially when under pressure. These weren't small differences. They were decisive. Worse, the Soviet command hadn't realized that U.S. air doctrine had evolved beyond individual machines. The Sabres were supported by a growing system of radar guidance, early warning aircraft, and tactical coordination centers, even without AWACS, which wouldn't arrive until decades later. U.S. rates, TANG, rates. Pilots were getting vectoring data from ground controllers who tracked MiG launches from across the border. American jets arrived prepared. MiG pilots, in contrast, often scrambled late, climbed into unknown situations, and were told to rely on instincts over systems. And the Americans weren't just tactically effective, they were strategically focused. Every engagement was a chance to test doctrine. Each kill confirmed a method. Each loss was dissected and corrected. The Soviet plan, designed to overwhelm through bursts of superiority, had met a different kind of opponent. One who fought not in surges, but in structure. And so, the first cracks began to show. MiG units that once flew with swagger started to report erratic engagement behavior. Pilots became hesitant. Coordinated attacks fell apart under pressure. The vertical space, once the MiG's domain, was now contested by a Sabre that knew how to bait, climb, and strike from unexpected angles. The doctrine wasn't bending anymore. It was breaking. November 8th, 1951. It was supposed to be a routine intercept. 4 MiG-15 seconds from the 324th IAD flown by seasoned Soviet pilots. Operating under Chinese markings, scrambled from Antung, across the Yalu River. Their target, a formation of U.S. bombers headed toward the vital bridgeheads along the Chongchon River. MiG Alley had been calm for days. The assumption was that the Sabres wouldn't engage in force. That assumption would be shattered within minutes. As the MiGs climbed toward their intercept point, U.S. Ground controllers vectored in a group of F-86 Sabres from the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, flying at low altitude to stay beneath Soviet radar. The Sabres executed a sudden climb, using the sun and terrain masking to their advantage. The MiGs never saw them coming. From the moment the Sabres broke radio silence and entered visual range, the engagement unraveled. The MiGs tried to go vertical, but the Sabres anticipated it. Using speed conservation and nose authority, they flipped into high-angle climbs, using tight turns and burst fire to catch the MiGs mid-ascent. In less than 5 minutes, 4 MiG-15 seconds were shot down. One managed to eject. The rest vanished in smoke trails. The Sabres, undamaged, returned to base. The event sent shockwaves through Soviet command channels. The engagement had violated every expectation. That the Sabres could not climb fast enough to intercept at altitude, that they couldn't withstand head-to-head cannon exchanges, that they would break formation under pressure, all proved false. One Soviet after-action report, obtained decades later, described the scene as chaotic and incomprehensible. Sabres appearing where they shouldn't, maneuvering in ways the MiG pilots weren't trained to counter, and firing with shocking accuracy. But what stunned commanders the most was what followed. Intercepted U.S. transmissions revealed that this wasn't a one-time ambush. It was doctrine. The Americans had studied MiG tactics, knew their vertical limits, fuel durations, and dive patterns. They had created maneuver libraries based on filmed engagements. F-86 pilots had access to camera gun footage, tactical debriefs, and real-time combat pattern recognition. MiG pilots had none of it. The Soviet assumption that superior aircraft performance alone would compensate for limited tactical adaptation was now in ruins. In Moscow, senior Air Force leaders privately questioned whether the MiG-15's advantages had been overstated. Some argued that a lack of radar-equipped wingmen or communications jamming was costing them the initiative. Others insisted the Sabres' 50 calories armament was just being underestimated. 6 barrels of machine fire, as one pilot described, that never stopped coming. But beneath the technical debates was a rising panic. If 4 well-trained MiG pilots could be ambushed and destroyed in a matter of seconds without scoring a single hit, then what would happen if the Sabres came in greater numbers? The answer would come soon enough. MiG Alley was no longer a contested zone. It was a kill zone. When the first reports of Sabre dominance reached Moscow, they were met not with alarm, but with dismissal. The Kremlin had heard exaggerated claims before American bombast wrapped in military theater. The idea that a U.S. jet could consistently outperform the MiG-15, the pride of Soviet aviation, bordered on propaganda. Soviet generals didn't just doubt the kill ratios, they denied them outright. Initial combat reports from the Korean theater were filtered through Soviet advisors stationed in China and North Korea. These were men selected for loyalty, not candor. When early mission logs showed MiG losses piling up in disproportionate numbers, commanders chalked it up to pilot error, communication failures, or temporary tactical imbalance. The aircraft couldn't be the problem. That was unthinkable. In one closed-door session of the Soviet Air Force Directorate, a senior officer reviewed American claims that the F-86 had a 3-to-1 kill ratio in MiG Alley. His response was sharp. Impossible. Either their math is broken, or their pilots are lying. But the evidence mounted. Radar logs intercepted by KGB signals teams showed MiG formations departing and not returning. North Korean airfields began requesting more replacements. Worse, the morale among Soviet pilots, many of whom had fought the Luftwaffe in World War II, began to fracture. They weren't just losing jets, they were losing faith. Back in Moscow, pressure intensified. Stalin's military apparatus demanded an investigation. Engineers from Mikoyan Gurevich were summoned to answer how an American design, developed with World War II-era principles, could possibly outmaneuver their best. Theories flew fast. Was the F-86 receiving outside radar support from ground stations in Japan? Were the Americans deploying secret ECM equipment? Had they discovered a flaw in the MiG-15's gun convergence. None of the answers were satisfying. The real issue wasn't technological. It was philosophical. The Soviets had believed in platform-centric superiority, build the better jet, and the battle is yours. But the Americans were fighting with something else, a networked combat doctrine, one that combined training, strategy, and coordination at a level the Soviet Air Force had never prepared for. And that left a bitter truth in the air. The MiG-15 might have been the better spec sheet, but the F-86 Sabre was the better weapon. For Soviet strategists, that distinction was painful, because it meant that everything they had assumed about air superiority, about speed, altitude, and firepower was incomplete. And the cost of learning that lesson was being paid in wreckage falling over the Yalu River. Facing mounting losses and increasingly shaken pilot reports, Soviet air strategists clung to a conclusion that seemed logical but was deeply flawed. The issue wasn't with the MiG-15 design. It was with the guns. If the F-86 Sabre was outshooting MiGs in close-range engagements, the answer had to lie in armament. Soviet engineers pointed to the weapon loadouts. The MiG-15 carried two types of cannon, one 37mm and two 23mm. Devastating in theory, especially against bombers, but slow-firing, with limited ammunition and poor accuracy against agile fighters. In contrast, the F-86 carried 6 M3 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns, lighter per shot, but faster, more stable, and aimed with a sophisticated gyro-stabilized gun sight that projected a calculated lead marker based on target motion and aircraft G-load. The Soviet theory was simple. Replace the cannon profile with better shot density, and the MiG would reclaim dominance. So engineers got to work modifying fire control systems and experimenting with 23mm dual feeds. Some proposed new radar-assisted aiming modules. Others recommended redesigning the cockpit interface to allow quicker target acquisition in tight turns. But none of these would fix the real problem, because the Sabre wasn't winning through raw firepower. It was winning through shot opportunity. In dogfights, MiG pilots often found themselves chasing ghosts, Sabres that could turn tighter, bleed speed less aggressively, and keep visual lock longer thanks to their superior canopy design. By the time a MiG got guns on, it had maybe 3 seconds to fire, and usually at an angle where the cannon's slow traverse and sluggish burst pattern failed to deliver a kill. Meanwhile, the Sabre could stay on target longer. It fired more rounds per second. Its 50 cals had a flatter trajectory, better spray distribution, and could be adjusted on the fly through hands-on throttle and gun sight controls features MiG pilots lacked. The Soviet command missed this completely. They blamed mechanical factors, not tactical ones. More frustratingly, in their race to upgrade firepower, they sacrificed weight margins and fuel efficiency. Some squadrons retrofitted their MiGs with new cannon variants that threw off center-of-mass balance. Others were told to conserve rounds for close-range kills, orders that proved suicidal when facing fast-moving Sabres who could open fire from range and walk their shots into a kill. As the weeks passed, it became clear. Altering cannons wouldn't solve the loss ratio. Because the dogfights weren't being decided by the size of the bullet, they were being decided by who could pull the trigger first, and with precision. American pilots, with their aggressive training, fluid tactics, and better sightlines, were entering every engagement already halfway to victory. And while Moscow ordered more technical revisions, more MiGs were being lost to a system they still didn't fully understand. By early 1952, with MiG-15 losses stacking into the dozens, Soviet command shifted to another explanation, one that would further delay real reform. They decided the fault lay not with the jet, not even with its weapons, but with the pilots. On paper, it made sense. After all, many of the Soviet pilots in Korea were relatively young. Though they flew under the North Korean or Chinese flags for plausible deniability, the core of these squadrons were Soviet airmen rotated in for limited tours. Some had combat experience from World War II, but most were Cold War-era recruits, well-trained. Yes, but unfamiliar with jet combat at high altitudes and closure speeds approaching 700 miles per hour. The solution, Soviet strategists believed, was to retrain the men, not redesign the machine. So they doubled down on flight hours. Pilots were forced through intensive simulator runs, technical lectures, and rehearsed intercept procedures. Dogfight drills became more aggressive. Formation tactics were reworked to emphasize kill boxes and angle retention. But there was one fatal flaw. The training was based on the same broken assumptions. MiG pilots were taught to engage vertically, to strike in pairs or threes from high altitude, and to fire cannons in short, high-speed bursts. That tactic worked against bombers. It worked against disorganized jets. But against Sabre pilots flying in disciplined, rotating coverage formations, it was suicide. Moreover, Soviet pilots were discouraged from improvisation. Their command structure emphasized obedience over initiative. Pilots were expected to follow strict engagement protocols, even as Sabre pilots flipped into horizontal rolls, used terrain to bait climbs, and conducted hit-and-run attacks from blind angles. The Sabres didn't fight by the book. They fought to win. The Americans trusted their pilots to make snap decisions, to break formation when needed, to dive into a fight solo if it meant saving a wingman. The result was agility, not just in the airframe, but in doctrine. Soviet pilots, meanwhile, were being told that if they followed procedure, the jet would take care of the rest. It didn't. And the worst moment came when experienced veterans, former Luftwaffe killers, and Eastern Front aces were finally rotated into MiG Alley. The expectation was that they would reverse the tide. They didn't. Even these seasoned flyers found themselves outmaneuvered. The Sabres weren't just fast. They were intuitive. Their pilots had months of combat experience in the same theater, shared real-time engagement tactics, and adapted to MiG movement like predators studying prey. One MiG ace, after surviving a close engagement with a Sabre, wrote in his debrief, "We trained for war, but they're fighting like it's already over and they're just cleaning up." Soviet command buried the quote. They couldn't afford to admit it yet, but deep down, this wasn't about training, it was about transformation, and they were too late. The Soviet Air Force did not just suffer from misjudgments in doctrine, tactics, or training. At its core, it was flying blind in a theater where the Americans saw nearly everything. From the first days of combat over Korea, forces had leveraged a critical and mostly invisible advantage: intelligence fusion. American Sabres weren't just fast and well-flown, they were informed. Radar outposts in Japan, Okinawa, and South Korea fed real-time tracking data to controllers who vectored Sabres into ideal intercept positions. Communications were encrypted, decentralized, and highly responsive. Ground-based intercept systems, though primitive by modern standards, created overlapping coverage that allowed squadrons to be repositioned quickly when MiGs took off from Chinese airbases. The Soviets, meanwhile, suffered from limited-range radar, poor signal discipline, and delayed response times. Their own intelligence on Sabre tactics was limited to post-fight interviews, aerial photography, and occasional captured debris, none of which told them how the Americans were always in the right place at the right time. One Soviet advisor based in Dandong began to suspect something deeper. His report noted that MiGs are ambushed from angles they should never be exposed to, at speeds the Americans should not achieve, at positions they should not anticipate. He was ignored. The truth was far worse. American reconnaissance aircraft RB-29 seconds, and later RB-50 seconds, had been flying missions near the Yalu River with virtual impunity. High-altitude photography and signal intercepts gave U.S. planners detailed maps of MiG flight patterns, takeoff schedules, and climb routes. When MiGs scrambled, Sabres were already waiting above or in hidden arcs, having been briefed on likely trajectories. The Soviets failed to grasp that they weren't fighting jets, they were fighting a network. More critically, they underestimated how tightly the Americans looped combat data back into training. Sabre pilots debriefed with gun camera footage, radar plots, and pattern analytics. Every engagement refined the playbook. Every loss was dissected within hours. MiG units had no such process. Their reports passed through layers of censorship and security. Losses were often downplayed or blamed on external factors. There was no integrated feedback system to change tactics based on failures. Every squadron flew as if they were the first to encounter the Sabres, never learning from the last. This failure was compounded by psychological erosion. MiG pilots began reporting ghost Sabres enemy fighters appearing from cloud banks or the sun, executing impossibly sharp dives or climbs, and disappearing without a scratch. Some began to suspect the Americans had new ECM pods or stealth coatings. Others whispered that ground radar was sabotaged. In reality, it was simply better integration. The Sabres were operating within an emerging doctrine of information-led air warfare, something the Soviets would not fully adopt until the 1,970 seconds. By then, the damage was done, and in the skies over MiG Alley, the cost of Soviet ignorance was being written in contrails and smoke trails daily. While the MiG-15 thundered across the Korean sky as a sleek, silver symbol of Soviet engineering, the F-86 Sabre represented something more elusive, a system of systems. The jet was merely the tip of the spear. What made it lethal was everything wrapped behind it. The true American system was not just about thrust, drag, or bullet caliber. It was about integration, how pilots, intelligence officers, engineers, radar operators, and mission planners functioned as a singular combat organism. At its heart was the Combat Air Patrol Network, coordinated through radar installations and ground control intercept stations spread across the Korean peninsula and Japan. These sites tracked MiG takeoffs the moment they left airfields like Antung or Mukden. With calculated precision, controllers would vector F-86 squadrons into high-altitude intercept arcs, ensuring that the Sabres began every engagement with the advantage. But it didn't stop there. Every F-86 pilot flew with access to gun camera footage, meticulously analyzed after each sortie. Engagements were studied frame by frame. New maneuvers were identified, rehearsed, and codified into training doctrine within days. A pilot shot down a MiG. His footage became required viewing for every man in his wing. Sabre squadrons rotated leadership frequently, not out of chaos, but to cross-pollinate tactics and lessons across units. Combat experience was never allowed to silo. The U.S. Air Force was building adaptation into the structure itself. Then there was pilot training. Unlike their Soviet counterparts, American pilots in Korea were part of a pipeline honed through rigorous combat exercises, focused on initiative, situational awareness, and aerial improvisation. Many had trained in advanced jet simulators, using mock dogfights to explore Sabre versus MiG engagements before they even deployed. Tactics weren't handed down from command. They evolved from the cockpit. Sabre pilots employed a strategy of dynamic engagement, constantly adjusting formation roles, baiting MiGs into climb traps, and using vertical scissors to force overshoots. They practiced high G turns not just to escape but to position. Even when outnumbered, a disciplined Sabre pair could take down multiple MiGs through coordinated timing and firing lanes. And while the Soviets were flying from foreign airfields under political restrictions, Sabre units operated from fortified bases like Suwon and Kimpo, fully supported by maintenance crews, rapid resupply networks, and secure communications infrastructure. Even American failures were treated differently. When a Sabre went down, the pilot's wingman often carried gun footage or a full radio log of the engagement. The loss was analyzed, briefed across units, and the tactic that led to it corrected. For Soviet pilots, losses were often written off or blamed on enemy advantage, and lessons were lost in bureaucracy. In the words of one U.S., "They were flying a plane. We were flying a doctrine, and that doctrine extended beyond air combat." American electronic warfare crews monitored Soviet signals. Recon aircraft mapped MiG movement. Political officers stayed clear of cockpit decisions, unlike their Soviet counterparts who often pressured pilots into aggressive engagements for optics rather than success. All of this, the ground control, the radar vectoring, the pilot autonomy, the rapid tactical iteration was invisible to the Soviets. What they saw was a jet that kept winning. What they didn't see was the machine behind the machine. The Sabre wasn't just a fighter. It was the first combat proof of concept that air power belonged to systems, not just steel, and every MiG that fell proved it. April 12th, 1953. The 133rd Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, one of the Soviet Union's most elite covert units in Korea, had been ordered to conduct a decisive show of force. The goal: reassert MiG dominance over MiG Alley in a coordinated push-day operation. 36 MiG 15 seconds would sweep the skies in overlapping formations, using altitude and speed to overwhelm smaller Sabre patrols. What followed was not a victory, it was a disaster. American signals intelligence had already picked up increased chatter across Soviet channels. Ground radar operators near Kimpo had watched the launch pattern for days, and when the mass MiG formation took off from Chinese-held fields just across the Yalu, Sabre squadrons were already climbing, waiting. The sky erupted. The engagement would last under 40 minutes. But in that time, Sabre pilots from the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing and the 4th FIW executed what would become the most one-sided air battle of the Korean War. 10 MiGs shot down. No Sabres lost. It was a tactical slaughter. The MiGs tried diving and regrouping. Sabres outrolled them. They tried vertical splits. Sabres stayed locked in. They tried to retreat. Sabres chased them into their own air corridors, risking Chinese airspace. The final radio intercepts from the battle recorded frantic Soviet voices reporting fuel loss, control damage, and enemy in every direction. Some MiGs disengaged so hard they oversped into mechanical failure. One collided midair with a wingman. 2 others were shot down trying to run for cloud cover. The Americans returned home to cheers. The Soviets returned in silence. In the hours after the battle, Soviet officers filed a confused and embarrassed report. It blamed weather distortions, poor coordination, and unexpected enemy positioning. But the underlying reality was clearer to the pilots than their commanders. The F-86 Sabre pilots had outthought, outmaneuvered, and outflown them at every turn. The MiG 15 seconds had entered with numerical superiority, with higher altitude, with home field advantage in range and logistics, and they had been ripped apart. Word of the engagement spread fast through the Soviet chain of command, through the American press, and even across frontline units in North Korea. The legend of the Sabre solidified. The myth of MiG superiority collapsed. For Soviet pilots, the psychological toll was massive. Confidence fractured. Flight leaders began requesting altitude limits on patrols. MiG formations became more conservative, less aggressive. Patrol rates fell. Engagement rates plummeted. By mid-1953, MiG Alley had turned into a no-go zone for Soviet squadrons, unless they had overwhelming force and airspace control, neither of which they could maintain for long. The humiliation of April 12th wasn't just about 10 downed aircraft. It was about being exposed. Exposed for building doctrine on arrogance. Exposed for training pilots to follow, not to fight. Exposed for believing that a beautiful machine could win a war without understanding the enemy who flew against it. And for the rest of the Korean War, the skies belonged to the Sabres. By the summer of 1953, the Korean skies were quieting, but not from peace. The armistice was near. Yet among Soviet leadership, particularly inside the military aviation bureaus, a different kind of silence was setting in, one defined by defeat. The collapse of Soviet air confidence was not just operational, it was ideological. From the beginning, the Soviet Union had built its military air doctrine on 3 pillars. Platform supremacy, where superior design compensated for limited flexibility. Command centralization, where decisions flowed from the top down with minimal pilot autonomy. And technological intimidation, where speed, altitude, and firepower projected deterrence more than required effectiveness. But the F-86 Sabre and the American system behind it shattered all 3. Platform supremacy had failed. The MiG-15, while superior in top-end specs, had been defeated repeatedly by a jet with inferior theoretical performance. The Sabre had been more adaptable, more forgiving, and more effective when flown as part of a coordinated, feedback-driven force. Command centralization proved crippling. Soviet pilots were ordered when to engage, how to maneuver, and even how to report their missions. This top-down rigidity turned combat into hesitation. MiG pilots could not improvise without punishment. They flew with fear not of the enemy, but of the political consequences of deviation, and technological intimidation fell flat. The MiG's big cannons, steep climb, and radar-evading tactics looked formidable on paper, but failed to connect in battle. Meanwhile, American radar networks, gun cameras, and post-fight debrief loops made the Sabres smarter, faster, and deadlier by the day. Worst of all, Soviet propaganda had no answer. For years, they had broadcast that the MiG-15 was the pinnacle of jet warfare, undefeated, unchallenged, unmatched. Now, that myth was burning in Korean airspace, one wrecked fuselage at a time. Soviet press agents were forced to fabricate kill ratios, downplay combat, and pretend MiG losses were North Korean or Chinese, not Russian. But inside the Kremlin, the truth circulated. A private KGB memo from late 1953 summarized the problem. We underestimated the American pilot. We overestimated the machine. We trained our men to win battles we thought we understood. But the war moved faster than our thinking. It was a bitter admission, and one that would ripple into decades of Soviet military development. From that point on, Soviet design philosophy began shifting not away from advanced hardware, but towards systems-based warfare. They would develop integrated SAM networks, surveillance aircraft, and new generations of fighters like the MiG-21, all with one goal: prevent another Sabre-shaped disaster. Because MiG Alley hadn't just taken down aircraft, it had broken the image of Soviet air supremacy. And once broken, that image would never fully recover. Decades after the last MiG and Sabre vanished from the skies over Korea, their dogfights remain etched into the bones of Cold War strategy. But for Soviet planners, the real legacy of MiG Alley wasn't in the aircraft wreckage, it was in the memory of surprise. Every radar scan that failed to detect a flanking Sabre. Every pilot who came home with cannon holes but no explanation. Every engagement that ended before it truly began. They haunted Moscow like ghosts. In later years, Soviet aerospace engineers would reference Korea not by name, but by implication. Test pilots whispered about the Sabre problem during the design of new interceptors. Intelligence officers analyzed footage of American air exercises with an urgency that bordered on obsession. A deep, unspoken mandate spread across Soviet aviation. Never let the Americans get ahead again. But the scar ran deeper than aircraft. MiG Alley forced the Soviet Union to reconsider the balance between man, machine, and system. It proved that the future would not be won by speed alone, or altitude, or gun size. It would be won by integration of pilot skill, information flow, combat doctrine, and tactical innovation. And though the USSR would go on to produce formidable aircraft in the decades to follow the MiG-21, the Su-27, even the MiG-31, each carried echoes of a lesson paid for in blood over Korea. Control the sky not with steel, but with synergy. Today, the F-86 Sabre is a museum piece. So is the MiG-15. But their battle in the skies above the Yalu River is still studied in war colleges, still dissected by strategists, still referenced in defense planning documents, because what happened in that narrow stretch of airspace wasn't just a clash of jets. It was the first true war of the post-industrial air age, and while the Cold War raged for decades more, for Soviet air doctrine it had already suffered its first, undeniable, irreversible defeat in the cold, clouded winds of MiG Alley.